Asking for It, a Novel Approach. Chapter 72. The canals of Venice, California, were dug at the turn of the 20th century. By the end of the 1920s, most had been backfilled, their utility in question as the automotive industry boomed. 40 years and more, the remainder were largely neglected, silted in and left stagnant. It wasn't until the 1980s that the 5 surviving canals were renovated. Soon the original bungalows along each canal were being demolished and replaced with large, luxurious and modern homes. Ruth Ann Danzig sits in a ridiculously comfortable wicker chair, the cushions for which have begun to mildew just a little. The mid-morning sun is warming the fragrant air in beneath the bougainvillea, so she can hardly detect that mustiness. It is less than 10 feet from the little backyard's fence to the lip of the canal. Under the morning sun, the canal's own slightly swampy aroma intensifies as well. The air about Ruth Ann is a fanciful shade of pink. Closing her eyes, she can smell the sunshine. It has the same scent as contentment. Over the past 20 years, residing first in England and more recently on a busy boulevard in Berlin's affluent West End, she's never forgotten the more fanciful promise forever on tap beneath the California sun. Charlie has left her helpful instructions and provisions enough, but Ruth Ann does not attempt espresso this morning. Too many lights and buttons on his too high-tech appliance. It is the inevitable necessity of caffeine that eventually moves her out from the quaint comforts of Charlie's backyard refuge. She'll have to find a cafe. Charlie's is the tiniest cottage still claiming space on this side of the canal, the last of the originals, built in 1902, 1903 maybe. From the nearest arched wooden bridge, you can hardly make the place out behind the cluster of flowering bushes and vines surrounding it. By the front door, there is barely enough space for the e-bike Ruth Ann rented yesterday down at the beach. Where Charlie parks the Audi TT he's left her the keys for, she hasn't looked into. It's no doubt in the instructions, but she has no intention of retrieving it during her stay. She climbs out from the wicker's embrace, stretches her lithe 6-foot frame briefly, then ducks in beneath the blossoms hooding Charlie's patio door. Chapter 73. Meekness did not deliver a screenplay for Lance. He did not deliver a treatment. He did, however, provide Jim's streetheart a purpose-written raison d'être, a rousing rationale for his wacko society and their cause. He managed it all in one well-turned rumination, and it was the most fun he'd written in years. For 10 taut pages, he'd stroked the already revered eternal feminine right where he imagined it would feel best. To him it felt every bit as right as it sounded absurd. Definitely a writing assignment to challenge his rhetorical powers. And it was only partially inspired by another of the man's generous, gilt-edged checks. It was, in short, well-remunerated writing, not requiring his servicing a contingent of soul-sucking industry types, his usual. On the verge of going to bed, Meekness tips up the last of a bottle of red. In the morning, he'll have his phone line back. He's paid his account arrears and a punitive new sign-up deposit. With the SDMP's cash, what remains after paying down 3 separate bar tabs, he'll pay his 3 months' back rent and another in advance. He'll also go around to clear his tab at Ted's Cafe. he drifts off contentedly. No anxious tossing and turning to get there. Manfred sleeps well, uncommonly well. The bottle of red, the bottom half of which should have been good for the next day's after-writing reward, doesn't hurt his slumber. But the fickle minions of Morpheus, charged with the nocturnal restoration of LA's creative content providers, take umbrage with Meekness's cheaply won oblivion. The balance of his night is a strange and turbulent affair. Nearing the long night's end, Manfred's eerily disturbing dreams abate. They've featured his one-time partner, his one great love, Ruth Ann Danzig. She's haunted his night, a half-smiling sentinel, expression almost beatific. In the 20 years since their separation, a far less enigmatic Ruth Ann has been a not infrequent visitor to his dreams. He left her for the warm, elastic embrace of a less human muse. But this night, Ruth Ann's image has presided, like some orthodox church icon, over his similarly two-dimensional dreams. The Mona Lisa smile has not reassured his trepidatious dream soul. The dreams have thrummed with an undifferentiated, all too familiar shame. At its peak, somewhere just before dawn, the shame required his utter capitulation. To what? Whom? Dread and uncertainty plagued him. Waking, he shakes off the dread, only with a concerted effort. The little lacy shawl has fallen from the window again. The sun streams into his space unchallenged. It's a sunglasses and aspirin morning, and no doubt. Gradually, Meekness accepts a further burden, more fallout from his dreams. In the years since her departure, he has denied Ruth Ann's significance only by considerable force of will. Intermittently, a ghostly muse has aided him in this affair. But for years now, mocking his faithlessness, even this ghost muse has forsaken him. Ruth Ann was not merely the best woman he'd ever known. She'd been a goddess to his heathen heart. Meekness senses juvenile desire, painfully resurrected in the blinding headache of morning. He's almost 60 years of age. It should hurt. It should. They'd met at the much-belated funeral of his adolescence. He'd fallen in thrall to her, his first great love, and very simply, she'd merited this devotion. Ruth Ann had amazing ideas. They'd tangoed with his own, capably following his every lead, often propelling him in dizzying new directions. With mind and with body, everything she did was alluring. Irrational in the difficult light of day, Meekness feels an energy he takes for Ruth Ann's spirit. His dick is even stirring. Her spirituality had always been a sensual one. His burgeoning heart-on attests to the impact of her carnal energy, enduringly seared into his libidinal hide. And yet he had walked away, intimidated by her more wholesome qualities. For every moment's horny madness, there was a corresponding suspicion of her domestic perfection, and the heavy responsibilities attending it. What a perfect wife she'd have made. What was that facile expression again? What was he thinking? Basically, he hadn't been. He'd panicked. He walked, and not long after, Ruth Ann flew. First to graduate school in England, then Paris, he'd heard. Easy to imagine. It had been her style book even before they'd met. His regular bean stop is closed, shuttered and derelict. There's no sign of Ted. Not even the usual "Gone Fishing" with a PH sign on the door. It's dark and empty. Closed. Something is not right in the universe. Some kind of psychic disturbance. Nothing less could explain this unprecedented break with neighborhood protocol. Either that, or Ted's heart has finally rebelled at its enormous workload. A dark foreboding dogs Meekness as he shuffles up the sidewalk, eventually turning on to Abbot Kinney, home to some of the more genteel of Venice businesses. He hesitates before the faux marble facade of Il Bacio, sniffs the admittedly attractive aroma, peers skeptically through his reflection in the big picture window. All he needs is one decent espresso, and there's almost certainly one just the other side of this pane of glass. If Ted is dead, he's dead. No amount of superstition, no principled boycotting the fancy cafes of the world will bring him back. Apparently, the place's pretensions to prestige do not extend to its clientele. Meekness stands well back from the person ahead of him in line. The rangy dude looks intimidating. It's a ridiculous observation, Meekness immediately remonstrates with himself. For one, he can only see the guy's back. Black hoodie inside a well-worn leather coat, shapeless jeans, and scuffed biker's boots. Damn, but he feels fragile this morning. He needs that coffee. Hood up, hands deep in the leather coat's pockets, the guy ahead steps to the till. Meekness stays where he is. Out of earshot, he still catches a tang of something familiar in the muffled exchange. He's frozen in place as the specter, a hooded likeness of Ruth Ann Danzig, turns to leave. She doesn't even note the bespectacled scarecrow holding up the line behind her. She carries a double espresso in paper over to the condiments, splashes just enough milk in to color the coffee, and breezes out the door. The woman behind him, who'd already tapped on his shoulder, now gives Meekness a wide berth and a sidelong glance as she detours around him en route to the order taker at the counter. Presently, he manages an automatons exchange at the counter himself. The upscale cafe seems to imprison him. He's gone down a rabbit's hole of some kind. Each time he moves toward the door, some grotesquely glamorous patron bustles in or out ahead of him. His throat smarts from the scalding he's given it, downing the top half of his espresso in one. His spectral ex sauntered off up the sidewalk minutes ago, but Manfred is still processing the event. Event is the right word for it. That psychic disturbance from earlier on, now seeping back in from his nocturnal life, maybe? It's not pleasant contemplating such things. Meekness is not a genuinely superstitious person, more a little paranoid, perhaps. There was one event, though. He was still a mischievous teen, provisioning a loose-knit group of friends with grass and hashish, occasional tabs of mescaline or LSD. He was only a child, still living at home. He'd stashed the proceeds of his rarely profitable little business in behind a picture frame in their little-used basement rec room. Meekness Sr. had only recently died of cancer, aged 47. One day, Manfred's stash disappeared. He racked his brains for an explanation. He'd always been meticulous about things. No way he'd put it somewhere else by mistake. His mother was not the type to quietly remove the money and pretend nothing had happened. She would presume the worst and flip out completely. No question. He never solved this mystery. All down the years he harbored a suspicion that his father, freshly physically departed, psychically perhaps still lingering, somehow had been responsible. Though reticent to preach, his father had embodied an ethic of hard work and humility. Wherever his cash had gone, its disappearance served as a moral lesson for young Manfred, just enough to shake him up a little. He never sold so much as a dime bag after that. Finally, there's a break in the shifting tide of Il Bacio's customers, and Meekness makes it out the door. He has a keen desire to drink some wine. A bottle might be in his best interest. He's already walking toward one when he thinks again of his father's ghost. He stops short and stands motionless on the sidewalk, newly suspicious of life's easy fixes. It's a conundrum, and no doubt, in his mind's eye, an hourglass empties its grains, and there's no hand to flip it over when times run out. Manfred experiences a sudden, overwhelming urge to shave and put on a shirt with a collar. The next moment he's back in motion, vaguely determined to attempt something meaningful and challenging. He breaks into a laborious trot up the sidewalk just as an e-bike surges silently out from an alleyway. And then he's on the ground, grappling with the meaningful and challenging task of drawing breath. There is pain in his chest, and he's maybe broken an arm by the feel of it. Ruth Ann bends over the crumpled form, anxious concern contorting her face. Her expression changes to one of disbelief when Meekness rolls, wincing and groaning loudly, onto his back. He begins gingerly palpating his bad arm. Ruth Ann does not recognize the meager, gray-whiskered cheeks so much, but the eyes, wide behind smeared lenses in battered tortoise-shell frames askew on the man's nose, these are definitely Manfred's. Good God, Manfred! I'm so sorry. For what? The cruel passage of time and my heedlessness of its ravages? Jesus, you haven't lost your gift for self-deprecation, have you? Are you all right? You can't get up, can you? Ha! The Lord's name in vain twice in your first two remarks. I've still got it. Oh, Manfred, I feel just awful. Do you think anything's broken? It's crossed my mind, but I think I can feel dignity struggling back to its feet even as we speak. Yes, I'm going to give it a try myself. Meekness, leaning on her arm to rise from the pavement, can feel the eyes of a couple from across the street. Even squatting on her haunches, Ruth Ann Danzig cuts an impressive figure. Back when they'd walked out as a couple, Meekness had reveled in feeling people's interest focused upon them. Now he notes Ruth Ann's muscle tone, even beneath a thick flannel hoodie and through the leather coat's sleeve. Perhaps she's real after all. Her cheeks are pricked with a healthful rouge. Stooping to fit her 6-foot frame under his good arm, she's a gladiator aiding a comrade fallen in battle. She's wearing a helmet. Had he dreamed some of this? He could be dreaming even now. By the time she's gotten him to his feet, Ruth Ann has almost conjured up a cab. Where are we going? Where are we going? To a hospital, of course. Whoa! I don't know where in the world of socialized medicine you've been living all these years, dear, but we're in America here. I'll be just fine. Nonsense. You could be seriously injured. I'm taking care of this, period. A cab dutifully takes them to the nearest ER, and with the help of Ruth Ann Danzig's Deutsche Bank MasterCard, Manfred Meekness is examined. He's dislocated his right collarbone. His right arm is duly bound to his side in a fixed sling, and he's prohibited from using it for the next 6 weeks. Given a generous dose of Percocet for the pain, he is released to the care of Ruth Ann Danzig. Sharing their second cab of the day, Manfred looks askance at love in the person of Ruth Ann. He is elated and boggled by turns, riding the novel currents bearing him along. She sits next to him, a poignant memory suddenly materialized, throwing light on his benighted existence. Head fuddled with the Percocets, it occurs to Meekness that man is inversely likely to believe in angels given the relative proximity of an ignominious death. He reaches for the pen and notebook in his jacket's breast pocket, but finds there pain in its place. The sudden, jagged stab of it is wrapped in barbiturate, yet acute enough to arrest his search to express himself. He jerks back upright in his seat with a feeble gasp. Ruth Ann gives him an inquiring glance, but he's turned his wincing into an apologetic smile and settles back into the cab's new car scent and uncrushed velour upholstery. Minutes later, they disembark before an absurdly quaint little urban cottage. Manfred knows on some level roughly where he is, but prefers to embrace the illusion of entering an ancient woodland abode a la the Brothers Grimm. He is vaguely conscious of feeling intimidated. He's been dealt what appears a winning hand, but the stakes are far too high. Should he bet on it? Beneath the barbiturate blanket, part of him is anxiously preparing for the fight of his life. Fatigue will forestall that fight, though. Had anxiety not been ruining his sleep of late, he might last longer. As it is, on a daybed banked up with pillows, Meekness takes a luxurious plunge. Ruth Ann smiles. Butterflies flutter. Ruth Ann makes the little exclamation of dismay that always accompanied her breaking a dish or burning her finger. Bees buzz, and a mellow sunshine warms Manfred happily ever after. Meekness wakes, reluctant and woozy. It's dark inside the cottage, and his cell is ringing. His right side aching in dull waves, he makes it to his feet. He makes 3 steps in search of a light switch, loses his balance and falls by awkward and painful stages back against a corner of the daybed. The floor is cold but stable underneath him. His cell is done mocking him. In the silent dark he notes a subtle eau de cologne that should explain how he's come to this awkward place. Footsteps resound. Light makes him squint. Ruth Ann is collecting him from the ground for a second time. "Wow, you're having a pretty rough day. Sorry, I was just peeing." "I was dragged from paradise, kicking and screaming." "Will the patient survive?" "Damn, and here I was adjusting so nicely to the ministering angel. You didn't actually disable me by design, by any chance?" Ruth Ann regards him where she's managed to reposition him on the daybed. He is such an abused and emaciated version of the Meekness she used to know. The companionable man she's shared her life with more recently is still the picture of health at the same age, but that picture of health has taken well-earned early retirement and all too reasonably chosen to pursue a quasi-evangelical project of helping establish systems of irrigation in a drought-ridden corner of the Central African Republic. For the foreseeable future, he'll be busy drilling wells and digging ditches. Ruth Ann has not arrived back in L.A. on any such charitable mission. And yet, encountering Meekness in his presently diminished state, only his cynicism seeming vigorous as ever, Ruth Ann feels a pang of what she imagines Ronald must feel for the impoverished in Africa. Meekness stirs uneasily under her gaze, and Ruth Ann swears she sees a glimmer of genuine vulnerability there. Chapter 74. Lance has made such a big mistake. During his last recent trip to Toronto, Jim's streetheart, his most trusted confidant, had confirmed it for him. He'd returned to the theme repeatedly and emphatically. In the days since Makaela and the Edge took flight for the West, he's drifted on a sea of lethargy. The term depression comes to mind, and Lance supposes that is perhaps what he feels. If only he'd made a creditable effort at winning Makaela's affection. In the very rejection, for it would surely have ended in that, he'd at least have experienced the satisfaction of making a genuine effort. He'd at least have rolled the dice. And maybe everything would not have this big Makaela-shaped hole in it as it does now. Doubtless he would still miss her, but actively and within limits. As it is, time stretches out before him, heavy with regret and his smoldering self-disdain. His first night back from Toronto, a pair of legs came to Lance's rescue. In his dreaming mind's eye, Lance's one-time analyst crossed her legs in that same demure, inclined to one side manner. They were slim, elegant legs, and they signified nonchalant self-possession, with hardly a trace of allure. Lance woke up vaguely relieved. A vague tension of sorts had been released. He'd won a reprieve. The legs had not been Makaela's powerful gams. Neither were they pornographic legs, tropes for sex itself. They weren't shod in 6-inch stilettos or heavy-heeled leather jackboots. They'd been encased in modest, dark brown nylons, hidden above the knee by a subdued tartan skirt, and below the ankle by sensible low heels. The psychiatrist's studied asexual aesthetic had intimidated him at the time of their sessions. On this morning, the apparition of her legs fills Lance with an uncanny sense of optimism. He moves from bed to bathroom and on toward his kitchen's sun-splashed precincts, distracted and debating all the while the relative wisdom in perhaps looking up his ex-analyst. By early that afternoon, Lance finds himself at the woman's door. More correctly, he's found the door to her practice, to which he's navigated by memory. There's no longer any name or credentials on a zinc plate beside the door. The analyst may have moved on long ago. It's got to have been, a decade? On the other hand, this address could be the problem. His memory has not been flawless as of late. He was frustrated searching for the word faucet, for example, this morning. Spigot was the closest he'd come. If this is the right place, the right address, the stigma Lance remembers being associated with seeking out psychiatric help has apparently dissipated in the 10 years since his brief dalliance. Back then, he'd been greeted by the analyst herself and discreetly let out again following their sessions by a separate exit. In the course of those sessions, he'd never encountered another patient. On this day, he lets himself into a tiny waiting room. Seated across a lozenge of faux marble flooring, a woman is huddled over her own lap, immersed in examining the contents of her handbag. She wears a beige and cream print jacket over a dowdy white silk blouse. She's 45, going on 60, Lance thinks. At his arrival, the woman looks up with some alarm, then directs her attention back to the purse. Before long, the door opposite Lance swings open. A well-preserved woman, perhaps an honest 60, pauses before entering the little lobby. She wears a pinstriped charcoal pantsuit, a pair of shiny black brogues, and a pair of bold but elegant black-framed eyeglasses. Her silver-gray hair is bobbed and falls in a sheet to one side of her face. She glances at the woman with the purse and turns smoothly to regard Lance. "I don't have a 1 o'clock appointment. Can I help you?" The aspiring spinster speaks to her purse. "I was just looking. It's only 1 o'clock, Mary. Your appointment is for 2. 2 o'clock the day after tomorrow, Mary." The woman's hands tentatively emerge from her purse to snap the clasp shut. Lance stands in place, smiling, diffident. "I'm sorry, I came by quite spontaneously. I hoped to find a previous tenant here. Alexandra Taggart. She did talk. And talk is losing market share these days." Mary looks up at this pronouncement. She is on her feet, beige jacket buttoned, purse clasped securely to her bosom. She smiles uncertainly, consults a tiny silver wristwatch, then quickly crosses the room to the street door, which Lance opens for her with an accommodating smile. "I don't do talk. Mr. Abierti, Lance Abierti. I won't bother Lance Olivia Craint. My midday is not busy. I do therapy. But if you like talk, I'm headed for Starbucks." She was locking the inner door behind her, standing now erect and attentive, fixing Lance with a neutral expression. When he hesitates, she arches one eyebrow minutely above her bold black frames. The corners of her mouth curl with an obscure irony as she indicates the street door with an open hand. "Well, I wouldn't like to come along or not, Mr. Abierti. I must have coffee." She smiles affably now, passing him on her way out the door to the street. Outside, Lance fumbles with his parasols as she locks the door behind them. The therapist moves, purposeful, up the pedestrian mall, half turning to regard Lance without breaking stride. She indicates her eyeglasses with a slender, ringless index finger. "Do you find they help? With more than the sun, I mean?" She cuts between groups of slower-moving professionals on lunch break and is crossing the threshold to Starbucks before Lance can formulate a reply. Joining the short queue, she turns again to face him. "Sorry, even talk should be therapy. So, do your designer sunglasses help?" "I guess I flatter myself that they look sophisticated." "And do people defer to this sophistication?" Lance blushes at Olivia Craint's candor. The therapist smiles, as if surprised by undue gratitude. "I've been thinking about getting some for myself. Parasols, that is." She places her order brusquely, ignoring the cafe's brand nomenclature. Lance offers the counter girl a reassuring wink and grin, doubles the order in Starbucks speak, pays for both, and joins Olivia Craint at the pink cup counter. "A gallant, then." She follows his gaze to where it has snagged upon a female college student's plump denim rump. His attention has actually been caught by the back of the girl's sweatshirt, which reads in bold orange letters, "Medicine." "Excuse me, miss." The girl turns and looks at them expectantly. "Would you say my friend here's specs give him a look of sophistication?" Lance places the parasols low on the bridge of his nose and mugs obligingly, pursing his lips, slightly raising and turning his jaw. The 20-something looks from Olivia to Lance and back again. I don't know, I guess. Kind of Marcello Mastroianni. He was my mother's favorite. Is that sophisticated? They look each other over for another moment before Olivia thanks the girl, who then leaves with a tight laugh and shake of her head. Therapy? Life is therapy, Lance, don't you think? Openness to one's life lessons, all in one's attitude, isn't it? Back in the little antechamber of her practice, Olivia Craint waits while Lance fusses over closing the street door, which has its own perfectly effective return spring mechanism. When he turns to follow her in, Olivia has stopped, facing him in the middle of the little reception area. For a moment, Lance has the feeling they will kiss. The therapist pauses for another second or two. So, how can I help you? We're back to that, aren't we? Lance smiles awkwardly. Come here. A little closer. How can I help? As he steps within arm's reach of her, Olivia Craint brings both hands up, palms facing him, and gives him a rude shove. Lance staggers back a step, but says nothing. His mind is a whirl. You're moving away from me. You think the help I might provide you is on the other side of that door behind me. But still, I'm pushing you out into the street. And in fact, the therapist has replaced her palms on his chest and begun pressing him back in that direction. Lance cannot focus. He feels like he's been given an elementary problem to solve. He drops his gaze, perplexed by this sleek older woman's provocative behavior. A pilot flying without instruments, he searches the landscape far below for familiar signs. He yields another step before mumbling, I'm not sure I... Oh, dear. Take a seat, please, Mr. Abierti. With a minute sigh of resignation, Olivia Craint fishes out keys and lets herself into the inner office. Sitting, staring at the door closed behind her, Lance tries to dispel the sensation of having been called to his elementary school principal's office. When the door opens once more, the therapist emerges and offers him her card. Our time's already up? He can't suppress the facetious note to this quip. You are frustrated. Our time hasn't yet begun. Take the card, Lance. For the sake of argument, let us say that what you want is on the other side of the door. Lance will realize only much later that Olivia Craint has not specified which door. Chapter 75. Makaela is dancing with the producer. The yellow lighting, which seems embedded in walls, ceiling, and floor alike, has been dimmed. The producer is competent, if presently careless. He's a samba man. Hair in a swirl about her, eyes closed and lips set in a wide smile, Makaela glows. She opens her eyes to see herself whirling by in a floor-to-ceiling mirrored wall. She stops to look more closely. The producer's hands come around to encircle her waist. He buries his face in her neck. Her face is filmed with perspiration. Her tits are rigid and heave with her breathing. Behind this spectacle, a narcotic ensemble is playing a groove deeper and stickier than the music actually seeping into the room from every direction. A chanteuse is lusting. More, mucho más, por favor. The producer's linen jacket caresses her shoulder blades. Makaela is humming a little more herself. There is so much more in the air. They're wending a serpentine path back to the monster orchid on the dusty glass coffee table. The Edge hasn't budged. His expression is affable, but Makaela's not even checking to see. She ignores the producer as well. He glides off to freshen their drinks. She sweeps her locks to one side, dips her face to the frosted tabletop, and lifts a line with newly practiced ease. The familiar plucks at her sleeve, a pesky child. Makaela ignores it, luxuriating in her novel frame of mind. Only then does she look to the Edge, as if in afterthought. Holding his gaze, she pushes a sizable line off the table, then watches as it dusts the top of her one bare foot and the warm faux adobe floor around it. She looks back to the Edge for a reaction, then paints little circles in the cocaine with her toes. "Be my guest," she says. Then the producer is back, a drink in each hand, his swarthy, unshaven face as humid as her own. He parks himself against her rump, where it projects from the stool she's perched on. She feels him, half hard inside his worsted linen trousers. The Edge doesn't move a muscle. The ice in their drinks clinks, a tinkling of little ceremonial bells on the air. She watches their reflection across the room. The producer performs a little grind on her. Drinks held aloft, a Marilyn Monroe pout to his lips. Welcome to Hollywood, Makaela thinks. She cranes her neck around to give him a withering look. He eye-rolls to the ceiling, but deposits her drink and steps off to samba by himself nearby. Makaela resumes assessing the Edge's stoic silence. "Edgy," she says, "you know I can't cheer up for the both of us." Chapter 76. Lance is on the edge of sleep when his cell phone dock flashes orange. It continues flashing. It seems much longer than an incoming call would warrant. Why has his voicemail not kicked in? Finally, he gives in, rolls over and takes the call in the dark. Olivia Craint does not explain calling so late. They speak for an hour, covering his entire life, from earliest memories down the years to the present porn-induced miasma enveloping him. She listens attentively, asks cogent questions to keep him moving, topic to topic, deeper, gradually, into the matter of his misgivings. Despite disavowing talk therapy on principle, she enjoys, she says, listening to Lance's torment and troubles. The vulnerability he reveals so readily inspires hope for the wider world's worries as well. Lance smiles at this, feeling as a child might, being rewarded for good grades. Olivia is feeling magnanimous, she says. She invites Lance to wrap things up. He'll confirm his vows and take refuge over a Skype call. Not like a religious conversion or anything, I hope. You'd need to be ordained to do that, right? No, Lance, nothing like that. You've already made your confession. And indeed, all you've told me is nobody's fault but your own. But I'll need a more heartfelt mea culpa to help you. Something more tangible. Lance's inner child is a little crestfallen, having failed to tickle Olivia Craint's sense of humor. We'll go a bit deeper and confront the cause of your worries. Basically, there are two ways people pray: imagining God and going to church, or finding a darker, personal place and abiding there. God represents, to my tastes, a slightly wishful avenue. Lance notes that it's after midnight when he initiates the Skype call, using the address she's provided. Olivia Crane's aristocratic features fill the big screen of the MacBook Pro straddling his belly. Lance is slightly taken aback. There is no room behind her. No bookshelves or bedroom furnishings to provide context. Only her face in a stark white void. The neat hank of her silver hair touches the top of the screen. Her slender white throat disappears below. What is most jarring are the dark parasol sunglasses hiding her eyes. The fine age lines to each side of her mouth fix Lance's attention when she smiles faintly and addresses him. Like them? I do. You have good taste, Lance. I'm going to share a few things with you now, just because I like your style. You feel you're in some trouble, psychologically. Rest assured, I've heard worse troubles. You're receiving my help now because you've earned it, not because I feel you're in any real trouble. Ah, well, that's reassuring. All right, you're ready. Don't speak any more tonight. We're finding your calling. You are humanity's janitor. First day on the job. When you're done, you'll be tired. Imagine. Don't think. Just go to sleep. You've told me everything, and now you are understood. Watch your screen. Don't think. Watch it carefully and steadily. I'll show you a Kali yantra. Ignore the words. They are Sanskrit. You need know nothing about it. The screen behind Olivia Crane's face has darkened to a deep crimson. This is not a feature of Skype Lance is aware of. Her image fades, replaced by a bold geometric design comprised of concentric forms. The four sides of a vivid red frame border the screen. A port is cut from the center of each side. Inside this frame, there's a ring of white on the same deep crimson background. Within this ring is another in black. Within that, another in the vivid red. Lance's eye is drawn further inside the forms, through another white background, on which is another ring, this one comprised of 8 stylized petals in the deep crimson and red. Within that, still more rings, red, black, and white, successively smaller en route to the center. Within these rings, the deep crimson wash again, surmounted by a bold white isosceles triangle, oriented on its tip. Progressively smaller versions are nested within crimson, red, white, crimson again. Or is this last actually black? Traveling in this far, Lance can no longer quite differentiate. Within the smallest triangle is a vivid red dot, the center of which is the center of things. As instructed, Lance has observed the design closely, his eye traveling from the perimeter in through the concentric forms to the red dot at their center and out again. As instructed, Lance does not hear the mantra being recited. Time passes unheeded. The yantra fades again. Lance hasn't really noted the transition, but Olivia Crane's face, still mildly smiling, confronts him from the brilliant white screen once more. He feels lean and energetic, almost weightless. Remember now, don't speak, don't think. Listen to this. Then I want you to sleep. Filth, perversion, loss of control. She is speaking a foreign language. He's reading her lips. The language he knows, only he understands. Filth, perversion, loss of control. The porcelain rim of a toilet bowl, smeared in excrement, its reek rising to your face. No, don't protest. You don't feel aversion. You are drawn to this. The screen behind her face is dimming to the wash of deep crimson again. Filth, perversion, loss of control. On your knees, vision swimming, nostrils flaring, salivating. You're a dog, an insect, bacteria filth. Humanity's janitor. You don't hesitate. Instinct drives you forward. Down you go, nose to the porcelain rim, back to your endless task. Her mild smile, the age lines. She's removed the persoles. Her eyes are glittering gray-blue, blue-green, centers of a deep crimson universe. Filth, perversion, loss of control. Her lips no longer moving. Lance is suffering a visceral need for cover, for protection. It isn't paranoia, not quite. Dreaming fretfully, he lets himself into his apartment. Everything is too bright. He knows before he can even try it, drawing down the wall blind will not help. He wants to find himself safe and sound asleep in bed, but this is no lucid dream. He cannot open his bedroom door. Can't even try. He can puzzle all he likes, but he will not solve this problem. Too much light is just the tip of it. He craves complete isolation. From what? The mere scrutiny of others would undo him. He slumps onto the avocado couch, thumbs the remote to draw down the blinds. He's interred by sepulchral light. Lance drifts off, dreaming within his dream, picturing the big cardboard box of family photos in his parents' bedroom closet. Hundreds of faces and places, familiar and not so, litter his mind. Half a dozen dog-eared black and whites feature his father as a young man. In each, he's astride or beside some old motorcycle. His face smooth, hair waved back from the forehead. Beaming optimism, you'd say. There's one other image, another of his dad's bikes, this one leaning, riderless, forlorn against a brick wall, forks and front wheel crumpled after a wreck. Then he's falling asleep yet again, wheels within wheels. This time he wakes to gaze out the half-open French doors of a comfortable country home. A breeze ruffles floor-length white cotton drapes. The house is surrounded by a modest border of wet green lawn, thick fir trees beyond. The sky is a rumpled gray, a gigantic bunched-up goose eider-down comforter settled over the house and lawns. Comfort, quiet, peace, bliss. His cell phone rattles. An old-fashioned latchkey in a huge iron padlock sound. It buzzes demurely at the same time. The ancient rattle and the fine high-tech vibration yank Lance out from his dream slumber. He reads Jim's Streetheart's name on the display and answers on the third ring. Jim's! How are you, Padrone? Sorry, that'd be for a woman, wouldn't it? Don Jim's? No, that's Spanish. Italian, maybe? How would a worthy gent be addressed in Malta? Jim's Streetheart is sad to undermine his friend's evident good humor. They've found the edge hanging by his neck. It is too hard to fathom what long, sad story lies behind that man's demise. The news really pisses Lance off. He wants to exhume the fucker and kick his ass. Well, figuratively speaking at least. Even after hanging up, he is not remorseful. This is not a point at which dreaming Lance wants to rejoin the wide-awake world. He thinks of the homeless guy he sees almost every time he leaves his condo. The guy always wears a blazer. It lends him the vestiges of a dignified look. In that one respect, the defeated, disheveled, and usually visibly discombobulated man manages to remind the world that he once had pride. Back before whatever humiliation befell him, before wind and weather rendered his face the ruddy red shield it represents now, perhaps he had too much pride, Lance wonders. Pride itself may have laid him low. The guy's raw, red face. It features a deeply pored and bloated nose that his eyes disown like some mark of shame. All of this is significant, albeit dreamily, obscurely so. The Edge had been homeless too, though while still quite young, and the way Makaela described it, he'd had a quasi-romantic time of it. Nothing of the tragic and pitiful that one imagines in the mature homeless person's backstory. The Edge had grown strong, held jobs, kept a roof over his head, became a champion. He'd beaten it, hadn't he? Slumbering Lance isn't so sure. Did the teenage Edge ever really outrun the crippling sadness that must have dogged him in the wake of his parents disappearing from his life? They hadn't actually disappeared. That would have been more merciful. They simply walked away from him. What could his father possibly have cared for him if he left to fight in some sad excuse for a war like Afghanistan? His mother's mental deterioration itself seemed to say, "I leave this child to the world." Was this why the young Edge chose to fight for a living? From every side, he'd felt the world's arbitrary punishments. He'd had to fight to survive life's injustice. And if the punishment just kept coming, if he'd never finally overcome it, that had to be a form of defeat in itself. The young Edge approached each new day already all but beaten. Over 20-odd years of adulthood, the task of concealing it must have ground him down. It gnawed at his foundations even while he was champion, had battered him relentlessly ever since. With Makaela, he'd actually been fighting back with every fiber of his being, as hard as he'd fought in the ring. Without raising a hand to defend himself, he'd fought to preserve his sense of self-worth. The world never suspected the insidious horror he squared off with on a daily basis. The shadow that swallowed his punches as though it was him that lacked any real substance. The darkness that loomed up and swallowed him whole if he attempted to confront it head on.